Midnight, 1944. A frozen POW camp deep in occupied Europe. Floodlights sweep across the wire, painting the snow in white fire. In a wooden tower above the yard, a German guard watches the second hand crawl toward 12. He's trembling, not from the cold, but from the secret in his pocket. Below, shadows move, prisoners risking everything for freedom. In 60 seconds, the siren must sound. If he pulls the chain now, they die. If he waits, he does. The clock ticks louder, every beat a heartbeat, every second a choice. And when the hand reaches midnight, one man's mercy will become his death sentence. This is the story of the guard who delayed the siren and sealed his fate forever. The night was too quiet. Not the peace of rest, the kind of silence that holds its breath before breaking. Beyond the fences of Stalag Luft 12, the forest slept under a skin of snow, every branch silvered by moonlight. Inside the camp, the lamps burned low, their yellow halos barely touching the frost. Dogs paced along the perimeter, their breath steaming like smoke. Somewhere far off, a generator coughed, stuttered, and fell still. Corporal Ernst Weber stood in the tower with his hands buried deep in his coat. He had been there for hours, unmoving, his eyes tracing the same loop fence. Gate, barrack roofs, shadows until the world blurred into shapes of gray. The smell of diesel and pine sap filled the air. Every 10 minutes, a patrol crossed the yard below, rifles slung, boots crunching in rhythm. Weber nodded as they passed, the way he always did, calm, steady, invisible. But something about this night was wrong. The cold bit harder. The lights seemed dimmer. And when the wind shifted, he could hear voices from Barrack 9, a low murmur cut short each time a spotlight swept near. The British airmen again. They were always whispering. He told himself it was harmless, just stories, jokes, prayers. Yet tonight, the sound carried differently, a rhythm, code. He turned from the window and looked at the wall clock beside him. 11:53. The pendulum swung slow and heavy. Each tick echoed through the tower like a hammer in his skull. 7 minutes until midnight. 7 minutes until the siren. Weber rubbed the edge of a folded letter inside his breast pocket. Thin paper, smoothed by weeks of hiding. It was from one of the prisoners. The kind of secret that, if found, meant a bullet. He had promised himself he'd burn it after reading, but he never could. The handwriting reminded him of his own daughter's school notes before Hamburg burned. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, slow flakes drifting across the searchlights. The camp looked almost peaceful, a place that could have been anywhere but war. Yet Weber knew better. He had stood too long on this frozen platform, watching men dream of freedom and die for inches of it. And now, as the clock crept toward 12, he felt it, that invisible shift in the air when something about to break finally remembers how. For months, Stalag Luft 12 had been a machine, precise, predictable, merciless in its rhythm. Every dawn began with the same whistle. Every dusk ended with the same roll call. Guards moved like gears, prisoners like shadows inside their tracks. No surprises. No noise. Just the slow grind of survival. Corporal Ernst Weber knew the pattern better than anyone. At 0600, the gates clanged open for rations. At 1800, the dogs were walked. At 2300, the searchlights crossed paths like clockwork blades. Routine was safety. Routine meant no attention, no suspicion. But lately, even the small noises of the camp had started to sound wrong, the hammering under the snow too steady. The coughs in Barrack 9 too perfectly timed. That morning, as frost smoked from the rooftops, Weber noticed something new, a faint white mark on the eastern fence post. Chalk, barely visible, but deliberate. A signal. He glanced around, no one watching, and wiped it away with his glove. A simple gesture. A death sentence if seen. He felt the sting in his chest as the chalk dust clung to his fingers. The proof of a choice he couldn't undo. It wasn't the first time he had protected them. Weeks earlier, during a random search, he'd found a British photograph hidden under a bunk. A young girl with curls, smiling beside a dog. The prisoner who claimed it, Flight Lieutenant Ellis Rowan, had looked at Weber with something he hadn't seen in years, fear mixed with decency. He'd whispered, "Keep it, if it keeps her safe." Weber had kept it. And that small mercy had started something he didn't know how to stop since then. There had been small exchanges, a cigarette, a scrap of paper, a folded letter that should never have crossed the wire. Weber told himself it was harmless, that kindness didn't count as treason. But treason had many shapes, and in a camp like this, even silence could kill. At lunch, Sergeant Chris, his superior, caught him staring too long toward Barrack 9. "Something you see, Weber?" The man barked, his voice sharp as a whip crack. Weber straightened. "Nothing here, Sergeant. Just smoke from the stove." Chris stared a moment longer, eyes narrow. Then he grinned, the kind of grin that didn't reach the eyes, and walked on. That grin stayed with Weber through the evening shift. He could feel it like a weight between his shoulder blades as he climbed back into the tower. The searchlight swept across the snow in smooth arcs, lighting the fence, the barracks, the footprints frozen into the yard. Everything looked ordinary. But Weber knew. Something had already changed. The rhythm was off now. The clock still ticked. But the gears inside him no longer turned with it. The moment he erased that mark, the routine fractured. The camp was still running, but he wasn't part of it anymore. He was the loose cog waiting to be found. By late December, winter had swallowed the camp whole. The snowdrifts along the outer fence reached a man's knees, muffling every sound but the wind. Inside the tower, the only warmth came from a small iron stove, its coals fading to dull red. Weber stood beside it, listening to the tick of the mechanical clock mounted on the wall, the same clock he was ordered to use to trigger the nightly siren. The rule was simple. Every night at midnight, pull the chain. The siren would howl once, the searchlights would shift, and the guards on rotation would log the sweep as clear. It was mindless work, but it made Weber feel oddly safe. Time obeyed him, even if nothing else did. Then one evening, a new order arrived. Sergeant Chris assembled the guards in the yard, his breath fogging in the frozen air. "New protocol," he barked. "From tonight forward, all sweeps occur on a 60-second interval. Any delay, any silence longer than 1 minute, will be treated as sabotage." His gaze paused on Weber, a beat too long. "Understood?" Weber nodded, though his pulse was hammering. That same day, he'd intercepted a low whisper on the field phone connecting the towers. The operators used it to pass jokes and gossip. But this time, the voice was unfamiliar, urgent. Escape scheduled after final bell. Timing exact. Between sweeps. Then static. Nothing more. He froze, the receiver pressed to his ear. After final bell, the siren at midnight. His siren. That night, he couldn't stop staring at the clock. The pendulum swung with a soft, cruel rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Each sound felt heavier, louder. The air seemed to thicken with it. If he sounded the alarm on time, the sweep would catch the prisoners mid-run. If he waited even a few seconds, the escape might succeed. But the punishment for delay wasn't a demotion. It was a bullet to the skull. He reached for his pocket and touched the folded letter. Ellis Rowan's handwriting fading from sweat and time. He hadn't opened it in weeks. He didn't need to. He remembered the words, "If the night ever comes when I run, think of her." Weber looked through the frost-glazed window. The floodlights rolled slowly over the snow, over fences that looked less like barriers and more like bars around himself. He imagined the clock as a weapon. Every second it measured was a choice he'd have to make. When the next patrol passed beneath his tower, Weber's hand hovered near the chain. The brass handle gleamed under the lamplight, waiting for the stroke of midnight. He swallowed hard and whispered the words he had memorized without meaning to. 60 seconds to midnight. And for the first time in months, he didn't know if he was counting down to freedom or to his own end. The snow had stopped. But the cold deepened until the night itself seemed frozen solid. The air was so still that Weber could hear his own heartbeat echo against the tower walls. He stood by the window, staring at the clock face glowing faintly in the lamplight. The hands crept toward 12. Each second struck like a nail driven into the silence. Down below, the camp looked deserted, the barracks dark, the watchdogs restless, the perimeter lights swaying in slow arcs. But Weber knew better. He could feel life moving under the stillness, a pulse beneath the snow. Somewhere near the wash house, faint shadows crawled against the fence line. Prisoners, small and deliberate, testing the rhythm of the sweeps. Each time the light passed, they froze. Each time it moved on, they shifted a few feet closer to freedom. Weber's throat went dry. He could end it with one pull of the chain. The siren would split the night. Guards would rush from the barracks, rifles flashing in the snow. It would be over in seconds. His duty would be done. And yet, he didn't move. Instead, his fingers traced the edge of the letter inside his coat. The paper had worn thin, the ink blurred, but he didn't need to read it to hear the words. If you ever see her again, tell her her father wasn't afraid. He thought of his own daughter, the way she used to wave from the window when the factory whistle blew. Before the raids, before the city turned to fire, the wind moaned through the slats of the tower, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke. Weber imagined the escapees in that forest, cold, barefoot, terrified, but still alive. A minute's delay could buy them that. 60 seconds of mercy. It didn't sound like much, but to men with a wall behind them, it was eternity. He turned back to the clock. The minute hand trembled on the edge of 12. The second hand moved with cruel precision. 57, 58, 59. He reached for the chain and stopped. Then, very slowly, he took the key from his belt and adjusted the mechanism just one notch back. The clock's face shifted by the tiniest sliver, invisible to anyone who wasn't watching closely. It would strike midnight, 1 minute late. Just 60 seconds. Enough time for 3 men to crawl through a fence. Weber exhaled, his breath clouding the glass. 1 minute, he whispered. That's all. The second hand swept onward, steady as fate. Outside, the shadows began to move faster, as if they knew the world had just bent, ever so slightly, in their favor. At 23:59, the world held its breath. The sky was black glass, the snow crusted with ice. From his tower, Weber could see the entire camp, the barracks half buried in white, the fence lines glinting faintly under the moon. His breath rose and vanished in small ghosts. The clock on the wall hummed faintly, a heartbeat of iron and brass. 60 seconds to midnight. Down in the yard, the shadows emerged. 3 figures, low and fast, darted from the mouth of the wash house toward the outer fence. Weber recognized one instantly, the limp, the cautious turn of the head, Ellis Rowan. The man's silhouette flashed through the floodlight once, then disappeared into darkness. Weber's pulse quickened. He pressed a hand to the glass as if he could will them faster. The searchlights swept back, carving wide arcs across the yard. Weber's fingers tightened on the brass chain. He could feel the tremor in his palm, the heat of the moment burning through the cold. Any second now, Chris would step out for his rounds. Any second now, he'd notice. If the alarm didn't sound at 12, the clock struck 11 hours 59 minutes and 30 seconds. 30 seconds, the first prisoner reached the fence. Another crawled behind, dragging a bundle of wire cutters. The third man knelt to cover their tracks. Weber's eyes locked on the second hand as it crawled past 40. Now, Duty whispered. Pull it now. But then he heard it, a muffled gasp from below, followed by the faintest snap of metal. The cutters had broken. The men froze. One of them glanced up, straight at the tower. Weber couldn't tell if it was fear or trust he saw in that fleeting look. 50 seconds, Chris appeared near the main yard, a flashlight swinging from his belt. Weber felt the blood drain from his face. The sergeant was early. Another minute and he'd spot everything. The tracks, the movement, the broken fence. The whole act of mercy would collapse into evidence 50-5 seconds. Below, Ellis clawed at the wire with his bare hands, cutting through the last strand. The first man slipped under and vanished into the dark beyond the fence. Weber's heart pounded against his ribs. He could hear the clock now, louder than the wind. Each tick a gunshot. 58:50-9. He yanked the chain. The siren screamed across the camp, one piercing, endless note that shattered the night. Searchlights snapped to life, slicing through the blackness like blades. Guards shouted. Dogs erupted. A gun fired. The second man felt tangled in the wire, his body thrashing as bullets struck the snow around him. Ellis turned, raised his hands, shouting something Weber couldn't hear, a warning or a goodbye. And in that same moment, Chris looked up at the tower, eyes wide. Realizing the siren had come 1 minute late, Weber's hand was still on the chain, the clock still trembling from the force. He didn't breathe, didn't move. He knew the sound echoing through the camp wasn't just the alarm. It was his own death sentence ringing through the dark. The siren faded into an endless wail that bled into the wind. Spotlights crisscrossed the camp like frantic hands searching for something already lost. Guards poured from the barracks in half-buttoned coats, rifles glinting, dogs pulling at their leashes. The snow, untouched moments earlier, now churned with boot prints and shouts. In the center of it all, Weber stood frozen in his tower, staring down at the chaos he'd unleashed. He could see them, 2 prisoners on the ground, one motionless, one being dragged backward through the snow by his coat. Ellis Rowan, his body twisted, half alive, half gone. A single trail of red marked where they'd pulled him. Weber gripped the railing until the frost bit into his palms. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. His clock had bought them 60 seconds. 60 seconds. That turned a man's hope into blood on the snow. Then came the voice. Weber. Chris. He was storming across the yard, his boots slamming through the drifts. Flashlight beam cutting a violent path toward the tower. Weber tore his eyes from the field and looked at the clock. The hands read 12:01. His lie was already visible in brass and shadow. The door below slammed open. Footsteps on the ladder, fast, angry. Weber stepped back just as the trapdoor burst upward and Chris appeared, his face red from the climb and the cold. Why was the siren late? He barked. You had one duty. Weber forced the words out. The mechanism jammed. Herr Sergeant. I corrected it. Chris stared at him for a long, dangerous second. Then he turned to the clock. It was still ticking, steady, perfect, betraying nothing. He flicked the pendulum with his glove. Smooth, no jam, no excuse. His eyes narrowed. You're lying. Weber opened his mouth to slow. Something fluttered out of his coat pocket, caught by the draft from the open hatch. The letter? It drifted to the floor between them, its paper edge brushing Chris's boot. He bent, picked it up, unfolded it. For a moment, the only sound was the wind moaning through the cracks of the tower. Chris read aloud, for my daughter. Anna, if I don't return, tell her I kept faith. Tell her the man with the blue eyes kept his word. He looked up, expression blank. Who wrote this? Weber said nothing. His throat had closed. Chris stepped closer, the letter trembling in his gloved hand. You were his messenger. Weber's silence was his confession. The sergeant smiled, not in cruelty, but with the slow satisfaction of a man confirming what he already knew. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into his coat pocket, and whispered, "You understand what this means?" Weber nodded once. He didn't plead, didn't move. Kreis's smile vanished. He turned, gestured toward the ladder. "Get below." As Weber descended, the sound of the clock followed him, unhurried, indifferent. Each swing of the pendulum measured what was left of his life. Behind him, the tower door slammed shut. The clock struck 12 once more, out of time. As if mocking the minute he had stolen, they took him to the guardhouse, a concrete cell under the command office, where the air smelled of oil, smoke, and damp rope. A single light hung from a wire, swinging gently, painting his face in slow circles of yellow. His coat had been taken. His cap, too. Only the thin wool of his undershirt clung to him, damp with sweat, though the room was freezing. Sergeant Chris stood across the table, the folded letter lying between them like a loaded weapon. Behind him, 2 officers from headquarters leaned against the wall, their notebooks open, but their eyes bored. This was routine now. Another traitor, another example. Chris began softly. "You delayed the alarm?" Weber didn't answer. "You delayed it?" Chris repeated, his tone a fraction colder. 60 seconds. 1 minute. Enough time for men to cross the wire. Enough time to kill 3 of ours. Still, Weber said nothing. The officers exchanged a glance. Chris leaned closer. Why? For a long moment, the only sound was the drip of melting snow from the ceiling. Then Weber spoke, quiet, even because she has his eyes. Chris frowned. What? Weber looked up. His gaze was steady now, almost calm. The girl in the photograph? The one he showed me when the air raid sirens began over Hamburg. My daughter was the same age. She died that night. He didn't know it when he handed me that picture. He just said, "Keep it safe." So I did. Chris said nothing. The officers stopped writing. Outside, a door banged in the wind. Weber went on, his voice low. "Every night, I've listened to men dream of home through those walls. I've seen them shot for trying to touch it. I wanted one of them to reach it. Just once." The words hung in the air like smoke. Then Chris nodded slowly, the kind of nod that ended a conversation. "You've confessed." He signaled the guards. They pulled Weber to his feet. No shouting, no violence. Just the sound of boots scraping concrete. Chris turned away, his voice flat. Write it up as an escape attempt. They marched him outside into the snow. The camp was quiet again, blanketed and still. From the tower above, the clock glowed faintly through the frost. Weber's shadow stretched long and thin under the floodlights. The guards led him past Barrack 9. The prisoners were awake now. Watching through cracks in the shutters, but too afraid to move, near the outer wall, the captain in charge raised his pistol. No words, no prayer. Just a breath, a click, and a single shot that echoed off the frozen wire and vanished into the woods in the tower. The clock ticked on, counting seconds no one would ever live again. Dawn came without color. Just a pale wash of light crawling over the camp, revealing what the night had tried to hide. The snow around the eastern fence was trampled and red. Boot prints led nowhere. The searchlights still pointed outward, frozen in their last positions, as if waiting for something to return. Inside the tower, the clock still ran. But its rhythm was wrong now, the pendulum swinging heavy, off balance, a faint metallic scrape under every tick. Someone had wiped the face clean, leaving behind a smudge of blood where a hand had touched the glass. Its hands pointed to 11:59, then stopped. The guard said nothing about the shooting, The paperwork filed that morning listed only one line: Guard Weber killed attempting escape. No mention of the letter. No mention of the delay. No mention of the 60 seconds that changed everything. Days later, when Allied bombers passed overhead, the men in Barrack 9 pressed their faces to the cracks in the wood and whispered a name they weren't supposed to know. One of them, Ellis Rowan, was still alive, his arm in a sling, his eyes hollow. He didn't speak for 3 days. Then, when a medic slipped him a pencil, he began to write. He wrote about the clock that struck late, about the snow, about the shadow in the tower that hadn't raised the alarm. He waited. Rowan scrawled, his handwriting shaking. He could have condemned us and didn't. He bought us 60 seconds not to live, but to remember what mercy looks like. Weeks later, when the war moved west and the camp was overrun, Allied soldiers found that same note pinned to a beam above a bunk. Beneath it lay a torn photograph of a girl with a dog. The edges were burned, but the eyes were still clear, bright, kind, alive. They sent it to London with the prisoner's records. Nobody knew who the guard was, or whose child the photo showed. When the camp was dismantled months later, a mechanic tried to restart the tower clock. It worked for exactly 60 seconds. Then the gears jammed, and the second hand froze. 11:59, forever a minute before midnight. The soldiers left it that way. They said it felt right, years later. The site of Stalag Luft 12 became nothing more than a patch of weeds and snowdrifts on the edge of a forest. The barracks rotted away, the towers rusted, and the fences fell to the ground like broken ribs. Only one thing survived the clock. It was recovered by engineers during the post-war clearings, its glass cracked. Its hands still fixed at 11:59. Someone placed it in a small museum nearby, under a brass plaque that read, "Recovered from Guard Tower 3. Exact time of final sweep unknown." Visitors rarely stop at it for long. To most, it's just another artifact of a forgotten camp, metal and silence. But those who look closely notice something strange: faint scratches on the brass casing, like the mark of fingernails dragging across it. A man's last grip, or perhaps an act of defiance before the end. In a glass case beside it lies a letter. Its edges yellowed, the words barely legible. It was found in 1945 inside an envelope that had never been mailed. The handwriting is the same as the one on record Ellis Rowan's. The letter reads, "To the family of the guard who waited. Tell them he was no monster." He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw a man. No record ever confirmed Weber's first name, his birthplace, or even his face. His file vanished with the chaos of retreat. But among the men who survived that winter, his story passed quietly, retold in pubs, in diaries, in the half-whispered recollections of those who knew mercy when they saw it. Some called it cowardice. Others called it courage. History couldn't decide. All it left behind was a broken clock, frozen a minute before midnight, a reminder that between duty and compassion there is only time, and time always runs out. And so the legend of the guard who waited became a kind of ghost, not celebrated, not condemned, just remembered. Because in a world built on orders and obedience, one man's 60 seconds of hesitation proved that even at the edge of darkness,